Decolonization has become something of a popular theme in recent years. As various anti-colonial struggles swept around the world in the 20th century, the broader perception of the institution changed drastically as well. Something that was initially seen as a source of pride, an aspiration of sorts, now has received a completely different dimension. Colonialism became a dirty word. Various states around the world now scramble to erase their participation in colonial plunders and try to make themselves into its victims instead. All of a sudden, colonialism, which up to this point described a very narrow and very specific concept, now is applied to so many different situations that it would seem like practically every state in existence became guilty of it on the basis of engaging in conquest and expansion. In the asoiaf fandom, this watered-down definition is most often used against House Targaryen and its efforts to unify Westeros, with many insisting that these actions were colonial in nature. So, were they? For the short answer, no, the conquest of Westeros was not colonialism, but as always, I assume that you're here for a long answer. I very much encourage people to do their own research on colonialism, but for the purposes of this video, we will use a broad definition of colonialism. The policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. Colonialism is additionally accompanied by suppressing native culture, forcing the subjugated people to use the colonizer's language, share his cultural values and his religion. People focus very much on the control by one power over a dependent area or people, while ignoring all other aspects of colonialism mentioned later in that definition that are specifically included there because without it there is no colonialism, only conquest. The base of colonialism is economic in nature. Resources, such as gold, diamonds, cocoa, or labor, are extracted to the mother country at the expense of the subjugated one. This is why, for example, William the Conqueror's actions in Britain were not colonial, while the British colonization of Africa certainly was, since the extraction of resources was present and it was the reason why the mother country could develop so well. A special form of colonialism is settler colonialism, wherein the indigenous populations are replaced with an invasive settler society that develops a distinctive identity and sovereignty. Some examples of settler colonial states are Canada, the United States, and Australia. Settler colonialism does not always entail the creation of a settler state, though. For example, France engaged in settler colonialism in Algeria, but by itself it is not a settler state. Now that we have the definition out of the way, we can analyze whether this concept can be applied to A Song of Ice and Fire. Several places in Essos fit the definition of colonialism. We don't know a lot about the old empire of Guise, but what we do know is that they used slave labor, were colonizing nearby lands, and subjugating its neighbors, expanding as far as Sotoris and Basilic Isles. Old Guise and its successor New Guise invoke connotations with ancient Rome, which, according to some, ruled over its lands in a colonial fashion. The characteristic toga that the Guiscari wear also seems to resemble a Roman toga, even phonetically. We know much more about the Valerian freehold, which hits almost every aspect of colonialism. It was Valerians who conquered Guise and learned slavery from them, and for centuries Valerians were subjugating other nations in Essos and keeping them dependent. The Valerian freehold continued to expand, capturing many slaves from conquered lands and using them to mine great wealth from the 14 Flames, as well as building cities and roads. The Valyrian language remained a lingua franca in most of Essos even after the Doom, much like English, French and Spanish are commonly used in their former colonies. Valyria was also establishing settler outposts. Volantis and Tyros began as military outposts, while Myr and Pentos were founded by merchants on Andal territory. Lys was established as a pleasure retreat. Estaria was founded as a colony near the kingdom of Sarnor. Valyria engaged both in colonialism and in settler colonialism, enforcing its language on other people, exploiting the conquered regions for forced labor and resources. However, Valyria no longer exists. It was destroyed by the Doom. The only survivors are House Targaryen, House Celtigar and House Velaryon. Now that we established what colonialism is and given examples of colonialism in Planetos, it is time to answer the question, was Aegon the Conqueror a colonizer? And already we can say that no, because none of the things present in the times of Valyria were even remotely close to how the conquest of Westeros looked like, but let's expand on that. The Targaryens belonged to the Valyrian elite but were fairly weak in terms of power. They escaped from Valyria to Dragonstone after Daenys the Dreamer predicted its doom. For a century they lived there, uninterested in the affairs of the constantly warring Westerosi, but Aegon Targaryen and his two sister wives, Visenya and Rhaenys, decided to unite the realm into one. Aegon did not conquer Westeros because he wanted to facilitate economic exploitation. He could not do that even if he wanted because there existed no polity on behalf of he could do that. Aegon's reasons for conquering Westeros were because he was a dragon dreamer. He predicted the attack of the others from beyond the wall and wanted Westeros to be united and prepared for such an attack. And he was right. Aegon and his sisters did not enforce Valyrian culture in Westeros. Instead of forcing the population to worship Valyrian gods, they converted to the faith of the Seven. They did not enforce their language on Westeros, instead speaking the common tongue. They did not kidnap children in order to forcibly Valyrianize them, an act that was done in other colonial endeavors, for example through the residential schools in Canada. They accepted Westeros' values and allowed them to continue their cultural practices. Valyrians never had monarchy, yet Aegon crowned himself as king to better fit within the lords of Westeros and even introduced heraldry, which wasn't used in Valyria. Targaryens did not force other houses to marry brother to sister, and while some of them continued the practice, many others married into other Westerosi houses. In fact, as generations were passing, Targaryens were abandoning Valyrian culture and instead assimilated with the population of Westeros. Jaehaerys, for example, began preferring the Andal custom of male primogeniture. Targaryens did not practice settler colonialism either. Nobody was expelled in order to make way for Valyrian settlers. Most of the kingdom was controlled by the First Men and Andal inhabitants, with the Targaryens remaining on Dragonstone and in King's Landing. Many claim that Targaryens forced the great houses into subjugation, but in fact, if they were willing to bend the knee and accept Aegon's rule, they kept their lands and continued to control their respective regions, but not as kings, but as lords. All that changed was how they were referred to, and that now they had someone above them. A colonizer would never let his subjects have as much autonomy as Aegon gave to the other great houses. He would either destroy them completely or destroy them and place his puppet in their place. Many claim that Aegon's dream was just there as a justification for colonialism, much like other colonial empires wanted to justify their colonial endeavors by spreading civilization, but Aegon didn't colonize Westeros, so this analogy doesn't make sense. Aegon did not at any point exploit Westeros economically on behalf of Dragonstone, King's Landing or Valyria. He did not force the native population to work in mines the way Valyrians forced their slaves to do that. He did not implant settlers. He did not enforce his culture and religion. Therefore, the conquest was just that, a conquest, very similar to the conquest of Great Britain by Normans. And even with all of that in mind, it has to be remembered that Westeros was indeed colonized, though not by the Valyrians, but by the First Men and the Andals. Thousands entered and began to settle the lands, and as the decades passed, they pushed farther and farther north. The First Men soon came to war with the Children of the Forest. Unlike the children, the first men farmed the land and raised up ring forts and villages. And in so doing, they took to chopping down the weirwood trees, including those with carved faces, and for this the children attacked them, leading to hundreds of years of war. The first men, who had brought with them strange gods, horses, cattle, and weapons of bronze, were also larger and stronger than the children, and so they were a significant threat. The hunters among the children, their wood dancers, became their warriors as well, but for all their secret arts of tree and leaf, they could only slow the first men in their advance. Regardless, the children of the forest fought as fiercely as the first men to defend their lives. Inexorably, the war groaned on across generations, until at last children understood that they could not win. The first men, perhaps tired of war, also wished to see the end to the fighting. The wisest of both races prevailed, and the chief heroes and rulers of both sides met upon the isle in the God's Eye to form the pact. Giving up all the lands of Westeros save for the deep forests, the children won from the first men the premise that they would no longer cut down the weirwoods. As with the first men before them, the Andals proved bitter enemies to the remaining children. To their eyes, the children worshipped strange gods and had strange customs, and so the Andals drove them out of all the deep woods the pact had once given them. Weakened and grown insular over the years, the children lacked whatever advantages they once had over the first men. And what the first men could never succeed in doing, eradicating the children entirely, the Andals managed to achieve in short order. The first men and the Andals are not indigenous inhabitants of Westeros. That status belongs to those who sing the Song of Earth, frequently referred to as the Children of the Forest. The children used to inhabit all of Westeros, but after the first men invasion, they were gradually forced further and further north. The first men were using resources of the children's land in order to build settlements and expelling them further and further away from their own territories. While eventually they united to fight the others, their land was never regained. Further Andal invasions caused them to keep losing their sacred power and being driven beyond the wall, where only a handful of them remained. The children faced 2 genocides that nearly eradicated them. Parallels to real-world history are uncanny. Anglo-Saxon settlers in America also kept driving the population further into the continent, taking more and more of their land and causing their physical destruction through disease, starvation, and often outright slaughter. Indigenous Americans were often referred to as children of the forest, and whether that was intentional or just a coincidence is a mystery. Andals and the first men committed genocide against the children of the forest, took their land, and settler colonized it. The founding of Westeros resembles the founding of states such as Australia, Canada, America, and many more. Westeros is a settler state, and first men and the Andals are its settlers. The Targaryens didn't colonize Westeros. The Starks, the Aryans, the Lannisters, and all other houses in Westeros did, and the current characters are descendants of these colonizers, as well as settlers on indigenous land. Just by comparing the treatment of the children by the first men and the Andals as compared to the treatment of the first men and the Andals by the Valyrians, one could see a drastic contrast. Colonialism is an act that's inherently genocidal, as is settler colonialism, since it entails cultural and physical destruction of the subjugated territory. After that, the subjugated region is kept in poverty and misery through the drainage of resources. The only entity that benefits from colonialism is the one who colonizes. And yet Westeros improved under Targaryens. The once constantly warring kingdoms got united, drastically reducing the slaughter and misery of the common folk. New laws were introduced, new roads built, the kingdom began prospering, especially under Jaehaerys' rule. Therefore, to argue that the Targaryens colonized Westeros, one has to be met with an implication that a colonized region might ultimately benefit from colonization, which is not only patently false, but also borders on colonialism apologism. Not only that, but using the definition of colonialism that's basically when conquest would mean that every state in existence engaged in colonialism, which would render the entire institution meaningless. Finally, to claim that the Targaryens colonized Westeros would mean to significantly downplay the true realities of colonialism. Valyria and Guise were colonial empires, but the conquest of Westeros by the Targaryens does not fit any definition of colonialism. Nevertheless, Westeros remains a settler state on behalf of the First Men and the Andals, with its indigenous population nearly driven to destruction in the process. Claiming that the Targaryens colonized Westeros reeks of poisoning of the well in order to present Targaryen fans as supporters of colonialism, but in the process it downplays the crimes of colonialism and its very definition. This reading of the conquest is not only ignorant, it's actively damaging on that basis. That it gained so much popularity among various segments of the fandom proves that most people are either ignorant or just want to use scary-sounding words to win their fan war. You will see that the people with a negative parasocial relation with this fictional family will use all sorts of serious words in order to downplay their importance or portray their fans as bigots, blood purity, imperialism, colonialism, and recently even Nazism. That they remain silent about their favorite houses descending from genociders and settler colonists shows how deep does that hypocrisy run. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please leave a like, subscribe and share so that more people can see it too. Make sure to click the notification button so that you never miss a new video.